Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Good evening. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
Up to the mark. How are you doing? Everybody fine right there?
Yes, well, we're all, I think, just trying to stay healthy and stay safe. That's what we're all doing everywhere, right? You too.
Alhamdulillah, all fine right here. Thank you so much for the kind time. So, without yeah, wasting our time, I would request our today's host Said Hamza to formally start today's webinar. Said Hamza, over to you.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. On the behalf of Patriotic Pakistan, I warmly welcome all of you here in this online webinar. I am Sayed Hamza. I am joining you from Karachi, and my co-host, today's moderator, Sangeem Khan, will be joining us from Quetta, Balochistan. So today we have got the very special guest, one of the prominent figure from the experts on South Asia, Michael Kugelmen. He will be joining us from Washington DC. So now moving towards the topic today, we would be discussing and analyzing the very important topic, the situation of human rights violation in South Asia. As we all know that South Asia is the multi-diversified, rich in culture and home of billions of people, specifically from Pakistan and India. So at the same time, South Asia is facing both the traditional and non-traditional security threats, which directly impact on the great grave human rights violation, ranging from Afghanistan to Sri Lanka to Myanmar recently. And it would be unfair if I would not mention the aggressive policies of Modi regime, specifically in Indian occupied Kashmir, where the Indian forces have been using the brute forces against the innocent civilian population. So there have been huge concern among the Human Rights Commission. All they have highlighting and sensitizing the international level. So there are these all are the areas where the human rights violation have been taking place. Before we begin our discussion, moving towards the introduction of our special guest first, Michael Kugelman, the Deputy Director of Asia Program and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center. He is the leading specialist on Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan and their relation with the United States of America. He is the editor and co-editor of 11 books. He has written for the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and covering topics ranging from US policies in Afghanistan to terrorism to water and energy to food security in the region. Once again, thank you so much, sir. You would be enlightening us with your kind, invaluable remarks. The floor is yours for 20 minutes almost. After that, we will move forward to the question answer session for 10 minutes. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the kind introduction, and I appreciate the very kind invitation to join this forum. I always enjoy my interactions with Pakistanis, and particularly Pakistani youth. And I don't want to be too generalistic, but I think this is a young group, which is great. I don't need to tell you all that youth are the dominant demographic in Pakistan, and will be for quite some time. As I always value my interactions, and I always enjoy learning from you all as well. So what I thought I would do, I won't take a full 20 minutes because I want to allow for more time for questions. What I'll do is just perhaps say some general make some general comments about what I see as the human rights situation in the region in South Asia, and then talk a little bit about about my government, about the Biden administration, and what we might expect from this government in terms of how it approaches the human rights situation in South Asia. I think that may be of interest, and hopefully could spark some conversation for debate. So, in terms of the human rights situation on the ground, I think, unfortunately, one of the realities, not just of South Asia, but of the world, is that, we live in a moment when human rights violations are rife. Human rights conditions are just not good anywhere. And I could talk about the very unfortunate human rights situation here in the United States, but I'll focus on the region, on South Asia for now. I would contend that the broader dynamic of the human rights climate has changed for the worse in South Asia over the last few years, for reasons that I think are also apparent in the world on the whole. And that is that essentially you have this trend, this very strong and fairly long-standing trend of what I would describe as two things. One, toxic nationalism, and two, democratic backsliding. So in effect, you have situations where you've had countries, in particular the governments, becoming increasingly nationalistic. But nationalism can be a positive term. I think it could, it connotes the sense of, pride in country, pride in nation. That's fine, that's great. But unfortunately, the strain of nationalism that we're seeing these days is one that is dangerous, is toxic, in the sense that it entails whipping up divisive communal rhetoric and projecting it, and essentially trying to undercut and target opponents and anyone perceived by these governments as a threat. And democratic backsliding goes hand in hand with that. These nationalistic governments that are in power in many countries in the region, certainly India and Sri Lanka, I guess Bangladesh to an extent, they are undemocratic inherently, in the sense that they are not immune or not opposed to passing problematic policies, or coming out with problematic policies, or articulating speech that one could describe as hate speech, or other things that suggest that they are not democratic. And I think it's quite clear that if you look at the recent rankings of democracy rankings put out by organizations like Freedom House and some others, South Asian countries have not done very well. And India and Bangladesh tend to stand out, but quite frankly, other countries too, Sri Lanka, Pakistan as well, they don't do very well in the rankings when it comes to democracy. So this translates to more problems for the human rights situation, just because you have cases of governments that are either coming out with discriminatory laws that discriminate against ethnic or religious minorities, or they resort to just nasty, hateful speech that targets, again, the vulnerable, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, whatever the case may be. And there are several manifestations of human rights violations in the region, as I see them. One would be, traditional old-fashioned physical crackdowns or violence used by governments against citizens, particularly civilians. Obviously, this is something that comes to mind about the situation in Kashmir. And then also the second manifestation I would describe as discriminatory policies that target an ethnic or religious minority, or that appear to do so, even if the government claims that they don't. So, you could talk about the new citizenship law in India, which I think falls into that category because of its perceived discrimination against Muslims. And then third, and I think this one is particularly important just because it seems to be gaining steam, is the use of technology in ways that deprive people of rights. And this is quite frankly happening everywhere in South Asia and beyond too. China does a lot of this as well. Basically exploiting technology to try to crack down on freedom of speech and freedom of expression and so on. So, basically, if you look at a country like Bangladesh, which has used a relatively new law, I think it's called the Digital Act or something very simple like that. The pretext is to ensure that you don't have, nasty or negative content that's posted on social media, and it penalizes that, which is fine. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is that these digital acts or these new digital laws are used as a pretext to crack down on postings online that are critical of the government, but that are not necessarily nasty or anything like that. And so this is why you have the very unfortunate and tragic case of a young man in Bangladesh who was a writer, and he posted a message on his Facebook account about 6 months ago, maybe a bit more than that, in which he he basically was complaining about the Bangladeshi government's response to the pandemic. You know, obviously nothing wrong with that. And yet the Bangladeshi authorities used that law, that digital law, as a pretext to arrest him. And he was thrown in jail. And unfortunately, he died a few days ago. I'm not sure what the circumstances were, but here's an innocent person that was put in jail and died after having been penalized by what I would describe as a very undemocratic law. And then you look at the phenomenon of internet bans. You know, I think we oftentimes think of India as the country that leads the world in number of internet bans, and you had a very long one in Kashmir that just ended not too long ago. The ban that was put in place in New Delhi during some of the recent farmers' protests against the government. But you know, you have other countries that try to ban certain platforms or that threaten to do so, but don't. Pakistan has banned YouTube and several other social media platforms in the past. So I think this is a recognition of just how powerful technology has become, that these regimes, these governments, they believe that it's a dangerous force and that you need to essentially ensure that it's not used as a way to project sentiment against the government or that just happens to be critical of the government. And you know, obviously, you would know this, that social media has a multiplier effect. If you post a message on Twitter or Facebook, it could get out there in a hurry. And I think that's what governments worry about. They don't want to see this anti-government sentiment projected. And that's why you have what you've had. One more example I'll highlight before I move on. I think in the category of what I would describe as discriminatory policies, I'm sure some of you have been tracking what's been going on in Sri Lanka. This is very disturbing. At first, there was a time when the Sri Lankan government was ordering mandatory burials, mandatory cremations of Muslims. And this is, of course, something that's not allowed. It's against a religious practice. And the reasoning of the governing authorities in Sri Lanka is that because of the pandemic, it's not safe to have burials, even though, unfortunately, you know, you had people that had died and they were forced to. There had been people that had died, and their families were forced to cremate them, even though they had never even tested positive for the coronavirus. And now the latest indications from Sri Lanka is that it looks like the government either has or is trying to pass a law that would ensure that burqas are banned and the pretext given for that is national security. Now, I find this very troubling. The government there has sort of telegraphed these or shown the signal that can be hostile to Muslims. And those types of policies are obviously human rights violations in the basic sense of the word. But again, it's a nationalistic government that wants to push back against areas that it thinks can be threatening. So, you know, this gets to the issue of in Washington, U.S. policy. And what could we expect from the Biden administration? Typically, the promotion of human rights and concerns about human rights do not figure in U.S. foreign policy. It's not seen as a particularly big deal. At least in recent decades. There were two exceptions. One was during the presidency of Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s. This was someone who was very focused on promoting human rights and using US influence around the world to try to promote more human rights. It happened again right after the Cold War ended in the early 1990s when Bill Clinton was one of a number of leaders that tried to capitalize on the fact that you had the fall of the authoritarian Soviet Union and the fall of these satellite states of the Soviet Union that were also not democratic. So you had these new democracies being formed. And so Bill Clinton he was very focused on this idea of promoting the building of democracy from these new countries and promoting human rights as well. Now we get to the Biden administration, which is the third exception. The Biden administration has claimed that it's going to make human rights promotion a major focus of its foreign policy. And this is very interesting for several reasons. One is that it has been a long time since the US has used human rights promotion as a core pillar of foreign policy. This is not something that the Trump administration was interested in, and neither was the Obama administration or the George W. Bush administration. But the tricky thing, the challenge is that the Biden administration took office at a moment when, as you know, the U.S. itself has been experiencing a lot of challenges with democracy and human rights because of the unfortunate things that happened during the Trump administration. So the Biden administration has the challenge of trying to convince the world that the U.S., which is suffering from its own democracy and rights challenges, can be that global player that can sort of act as the voice for democracy and rights. I think the risk of doing that is that you could be accused of being hypocritical. But I think for the Biden administration, the view is that it separates itself, it distances itself from what happened during the Trump era, and it wants to argue that it can work with countries to strengthen democracy both at home and abroad. And the idea there is that the US, by working with like-minded countries, can strengthen democracy both in the US and abroad by working with other democracies. Now, in terms of what to make of the Biden administration's likely policies in South Asia when it comes to human rights, I do think that you will see this administration willing to call out, to publicly call out and criticize countries for rights violations. And again, very, very publicly. Certainly in most of the countries, I mean, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, Pakistan, for sure. Afghanistan is, of course, is a different situation because it's obviously a country that's at war. But I think what's notable is that the peace plan that the Biden administration proposed a few days ago, which basically entails very rapid movement to build a consensus both within Afghanistan and outside for peace. And it also included a draft peace agreement for the consideration of the Afghan state and the Taliban. These proposals are very are rife with human rights guarantees. The draft peace agreement that the Biden administration proposed for the Taliban and the Afghan state, all kinds of references to the need to safeguard women's rights, civil rights. It calls for a new Afghan constitution to be developed that protects and safeguard all of the advances in civil and human rights in the post-Taliban era. So that's very clear. But I think the question that comes to mind, I'm sure this is a question that you would all think about, is what about India? What about Biden? What could we expect from Biden when it comes to the human rights situation in India? So my answer is that I do think we can expect the Biden administration to be more critical of India than the Trump administration was about human rights issues. But I do think that much of that criticism, unlike with how it'll handle human rights issues in other countries in the region, I think a lot of that criticism will be privately conveyed. I don't think the Biden administration, even though it's putting all this emphasis on human rights, it's not going to want to promote that. It's not going to want to put that out there in the public domain, just because its relationship with India is very different from its relationship with most other, with all other countries in the region. The US considers India to be a key partner, and it does not, I think that the Biden administration will not want to risk upsetting a relationship that's made a lot of progress. Now, is that hypocritical? Yes, it is. But unfortunately, this tends to be how the U.S. functions. It's selective in terms of which countries it's critical of when it comes to human rights. Naturally, it's always going to be more critical of countries that are rivals or that are not seen as strategic partners. So you'll see the Biden administration be very critical of Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, certainly Myanmar, given events of recent days, other places for human rights violations. But when it comes to, say, India or Israel, for that matter, you're definitely not going to see the same degree and intensity of public criticism. One exception, I think, gets to the internet, the technology issue that I mentioned earlier. The Biden administration has made it quite clear that it views the undemocratic use of technology as one of its biggest concerns when it comes to human rights and democracy. So I think that that's one area where the administration will not hold back. And it was notable that the State Department spokesperson recently commented on the internet bans that India had put in place in New Delhi before the farmers' protest, and also commended India for its lifting of the internet ban in Kashmir, which is sort of like a subtle way of criticizing it for the ban that had been in place. So I think that's one area that we could continue to see some gentle but public criticism. But beyond that, I really don't expect all that much to be expressed publicly from the Biden administration when it comes to India, for the reasons that for the reasons that I mentioned. A lot of, but I think that there could be more comments along those lines in private conversations. But this administration will recognize that the current government in India is especially sensitive to outside criticism of its internal affairs, even from its partners. So I think that will give the Biden administration pause as well. So with that, those are just some basic comments, which I hope are helpful and spark some discussion. But look forward to any questions that you have, or rebuttals for that matter.
Thank you, Michael Kugelmen. We are truly grateful to your kind, invaluable remarks. Sangeen Khan, joining us from Quetta, Balochistan, he would be start the question answer session before winding up this session. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you,
Am I
Sangeen Khan,
audible?
over to you.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to extend our gratitude to the honorable speaker joining us from United States of America for such an engaging and interesting analysis. So before we go for the wrapping up remarks, I would request all the participants to feel free if you have any question. So please introduce yourself. If you have any question, please introduce yourself and ask your question from the honorable speaker. The floor is open. I think we have a question from Umesh Rizwan. Yes, Umesh, over to you.
Thanks, Mr. Sanghi. First of all, I'm truly pleased to listen to Honorable Speaker. My question would that the Indian government revoked Jammu and Kashmir special status and launched widespread crackdown, detaining opposition leaders and social activists, denying them due process, swearing communication links, and preventing access to services. So therefore, will Biden administration take action with this gross human rights violation?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. A great question.
Yes.
Yes, I heard it. I heard you loud and clear. I would not expect the Biden administration to take that path. I mean, when it comes to the Kashmir issue, I think the Biden administration's position will be just the same that other U.S. administrations have been, and that's to see it as a bilateral matter between India and Pakistan. It's not going to want to get involved when it comes to the rights, the human rights situation in Kashmir. Yes, I mean that is an area that would be of concern to the Biden administration, more so than the Trump administration. But what exactly it might do, I would not overstate what it might do. As I had suggested earlier, it could be that when there are high-level meetings between Biden administration officials and the Modi government, that the issue of rights and concerns about rights, it could come up in the private conversations. I don't anticipate that it'll be a big thing. Now, certainly though, if the crackdowns intensify, if you had a situation where, for whatever reason, the Indian security forces started cracking down harder, if they started making these large-scale arrests and detentions like they did right after the Article 370 repeal, and it's back on the radar, then you may have the Biden administration say more about it. But I do think it is important to highlight that if the Biden administration or any U.S. government is going to say anything about Kashmir, it would be restricted to the human rights situation. It will not get into the legal and the territorial aspects of the dispute. And when India revoked Article 370, the Trump administration did not oppose that. All of the criticism then was about the crackdowns, the detentions, the internet bans, and all that. And it'll be the same way with the Biden administration. But final point on this: indeed, if there's an intensification of crackdowns, if the crackdowns become particularly brutal, not that they're not brutal frequently, but if they become more brutal and there's a new type of crackdown, gets on the attention, gets on the radar, I think the Biden administration would take note. I just think that the way it would express its concern would not be through tweets or public statements, but more so through private conversations with Indian interlocutors.
Thank you so much. Now, if you have any question, anyone?
Yes, sir. I have a question, Michael Kugelmen. Secretary sir, I am Zohaib, a student of National Defense University, Department of Strategic and Nuclear Studies. Sir, US and India largest trading part, I think we cooperate with each and other in the South Asia. US and India have signed 2+2 PICA agreement, and before that COMCASA and JASMIA. And do you think US cooperation with India, military cooperation and any other strategic cooperation with India will violate and can accelerate the and maybe a threat for deterrence and strategic stability of South Asia? Because India have already deployed 1.2 million troops in Kashmir Valley, and India and Pakistan already a big rival states in the region, and US military cooperation with India can accelerate the situation in future and near future. Do you think? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Oh, sorry. Should I respond to that?
Yeah, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, it's a great question. I think that the short answer to your question is that it's already happened. That I think that the notion of strategic stability has been altered in South Asia because of this increasing U.S.-India security relationship. And it's interesting because it used to be, things have changed a lot, right? I mean, not too long ago, it was the U.S., you had a U.S.-Pakistan alliance where you had a lot of military cooperation, and the U.S. was sending a lot of arms to Pakistan, the F-16s and other things as well. Whereas the U.S. relationship with India was secondary, and India was much closer to Russia, or really the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But things started to change in the early 1990s when when the Cold War ended, and when India began a economic liberalization plan that opened it up to the world and made it more available for cooperation with countries like the US. And then you had shared interest over the issue of terrorism, and then more recently the rise of China. That's what's really driven US-India security partnership. So, if you look at what's happened over the last few years, the US and India, as I think you noted, have signed several defense foundational agreements, which basically enable the US and Indian militaries to work more closely together. Now, since India is opposed to alliances, that would not mean that you would have situations of the US and India fighting wars alongside each other. That's not going to happen. But what this does entail is more technology transfers, the fact that the US can now transfer very sensitive, high-tech technology to India that'll better enable it to enhance its capacities to engage in intelligence operations and monitoring of Pakistani military movements, terrorist threats, movements of Chinese soldiers. So that gives India, that really strengthens its capacities in a big way. And I don't think there's anything that the US could do with Pakistan that would sort of bring more of a sense of parity. Security, I believe that security cooperation to Pakistan is still suspended. It was suspended during the Trump administration. It has not been unfrozen yet. I think that right now the US focus within its relationship with Pakistan is Afghanistan, where it views Pakistan as a very important player in that process because of its leverage over the Taliban. So the latest news, which you may have seen, indicate that the US will soon be selling a number of drones to India. This was reported a few days ago. That had been in the works for some time. Obviously, that'll strengthen India's capacities even more. So it has a strong interest in stability in South Asia, and it has a strong interest in a workable India-Pakistan relationship. And yet clearly, what it's doing is strengthening India's capacities in a way that will certainly affect border truce between the two countries.
Thank
I have
you.
a question.
We
of
will take
continuing
last
government,
question. We will take last
as
question.
a cultural factors.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Hello.
yeah, I think he was asking
Hello.
a question. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
Many of the human rights issues in South Asia stem from the structural policies of continuing governments, as the cultural factors played a vital role in such structural violence. How and what do you suggest can be a long-term solution, as it is not easy to change the cultural values in South Asia?
Thanks. That's a great question. It's a tough one too. And I think that if you're talking about the idea of structural reasons for violence, well, unfortunately, you have cases where, yeah, well, I don't want to generalize. Every case is different across the region, but I think unfortunately, one of the realities of South Asia is that there's no one entity that has a monopoly over the use of force. You have different sources of violence. You have state actors that are violent. You have non-state actors that are violent. And obviously, Afghanistan is one of the big examples now, where you have the armed forces which are fighting their war against the Taliban, the counterinsurgency. Whereas you also have the Taliban itself and and you have terrorist actors. You have militias that may be aligned with the government. You have a variety of things. And then you have strong militaries as well that are not immune to using violence to pursue goals. This is also a factor, I think, here. But honestly, the way I feel about this, I'm not an expert in structural reasons for violence, so to speak, but I think that I think that threats, it's not just a case of governments or militaries that are, willing to use violence, willing to crack down. You have drivers within society as well, including civil society. You have the diffusion of hate speech coming from various sources, whether you're talking about, in some cases, religious leaders or textbooks in schools, or television. It's all across the board. And unfortunately, there's too much of this everywhere. In the United States as well, quite frankly. Some of the TV channels say some nasty things. You've got some internet postings by far-right militants that are just really scary. This is what has to be addressed as well. I mean, you can't solve these problems just by focusing on the governments. You have to start with society. But ideally, the governments need to sort of set the example, and they need to be the ones that try to provide these counter narratives that say, well, look, any of this nasty, this hateful language, this anti language and rhetoric against any group or individual is wrong. And here's why. There's not enough of that. That's the problem, especially when you have governments that are involved in the very hate speech that you're trying to get rid of. And this was certainly a problem with President Trump here in the United States when he was in power. So yeah, I acknowledge your point, and these structural aspects are important, but I think that solving this problem will require a sort of multifaceted approach that goes beyond just intensifying the government to remove these structural factors that drive violence, and you need to focus on society as well.
Yes, sir.
We'll take last question. We are already running out of time. If you could make a quick question,
Okay, sir.
and we would request the
Okay, sir.
we would request the
Okay.
speaker to make a short answer.
Greetings, my fellow.
Izzaz, over to you.
I have a very short question, sir.
Yes,
Please.
please go ahead.
Okay.
Okay. First of all, I'm very thankful to Dr. Michael Kugelmen for such a knowledgeable lecture. But sir, I have a question that whether do you see the democratic status of the Indian government, especially under the BJP government, is most recently the Freedom Institute did a student-based institute observed that India is on the verge of losing its status as a democracy. So my question is it a move towards a democratic regression or not? So whether do you see the future of this democratic regression? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that India appears to be going in a direction that a number of other states have taken, and that's what I would describe that not necessarily as an authoritarian state, but more so as hybrid democracies. This idea that you have governing systems that are sort of half democratic and half dictatorial, and I think Bangladesh certainly fits in this category as well. But I think that for the Indian government, one of the big questions as to its direction with democracy is how it manages the Hindutva agenda, the social agenda, because that's where I think a lot of these concerns about democracy emanate from. And it had come on very strong during the first few years after it was reelected. It got a really strong mandate. So it came out with the Article 370 revocation, the new citizenship law, the registry, the whole Ram Temple thing. So, but lately it's been struggling. It's had economic stress. It's had the pandemic. It's got some really major public policy challenges. So the question, I think, is, does it sort of put the social agenda on hold? Does it put the Hindutva agenda on hold to focus on economic recovery and the pandemic? And that could bode well for democracy. Or will the opposite happen? Will it try to intensify the Hindutva agenda to distract the Indian citizenry, particularly BJP supporters, from all of the problems on the economic side and the pandemic side, which could make the government vulnerable? Will they double down on the Hindutva agenda to sort of rally support from the BJP base? I'm not sure, quite frankly. The economy appears to be recovering a bit there now, so that could suggest that they don't need to do that. But I think that's the question: is how will they manage that social agenda? That, I think, will have a big say in determining what the future of democracy is in India.
Well, thank you so much to all the participants, specifically to our honorable speaker, Michael Kugelmen, for taking out your precious time, joining us from United States of America. Well, to conclude, we had already invited a few speakers. I mean, former Chief of JSTAR, Kalim Sadat Saab, he couldn't join. He was supposed to pay the vote of thanks to Michael Kugelmen. So, sir, in the end, on behalf of Pakistan Patriot Forum, we would extend word of thanks to you for taking your precious time. And we hope, as Pakistan remains committed to respect the human rights, and we would like to convey our message on behalf from our platform to you, that the innocent Kashmiri people suffers from the brute violent force of from the Indian brutality. Innocent Kashmiris are suffering in illegally occupied Kashmir. You are humbly requested to ensure to ensure that message